First of all, I should say I'm a little nervous because I am here tonight with a legend of my life. I've been reading his books. I've been seeing all of his films, nearly. Maybe not all, because he's done a lot. So to me, it's really an honor to be here and hosting this open club of European Writers Club with this special man. But before we go to him, let me just say that I am really warm welcoming you all on behalf of European Writers Club and our founding partner, Screen Ireland, that embraced the project European Writers Club from the very start. And before I go into introducing the guest, I should just let you know what we are actually doing in European Writers Club. We call it EWC. And in EWC, we encourage for co-creation and collaboration on European stories for a larger audience, meaning stories that can transcend to other countries than of their origin, which means stories that can speak up our European similarities in respect of our differences and diversities. It is, you can say, a project about also democratic value. Wow, I said it. So that's all what we're doing. And I think it's a lot. So, now we get to it. When I was young, I grew up with films like Midnight Express, Local Hero, and I mean, Chariots of Fire, all of those magnificent films that brought something to me and that shaped me as a producer, not at all on the level of the man we are going to listen to very soon. I saw his film, The Duelists, which is maybe one of my favorites. I read his book, Enigma, one of his books, which is a fantastic exploration of a producer's mindset. And when we are here with European Writers Club in our 4 hubs around in Europe, we always tend to do these open clubs. And these open clubs are for our participants to meet the local industry around a local legend. And I should say, we really have a legend here tonight. You should be very proud to have him, and we are very proud to have you. So, David Puttnam, come out on stage and throw it away from here.
Wow, thank you very much indeed. I'm also a little nervous tonight, but maybe for a different reason. As storytellers, you may all appreciate this. Last week, I was in London. I had to give a speech. It was an important speech to me at BAFTA because it was my farewell as president of the Film Distributors Association after probably far too many years. And I was having breakfast ahead of the event, and with a very nice person talking about training. And I don't know if you've had this experience. I hope to God you haven't, but if you have, you'll sympathize or empathize. I suddenly was aware of the fact that something in my mouth wasn't what I was eating. And I realized what had actually happened was my bridge had dislodged and it was in my mouth. So anyway, I fortunately had my COVID mask with me. I whipped that on very quickly as I could and very decorously dropped my bridge into my pocket and did my best to continue the conversation. The problem being twofold. Number one, was not a pretty sight, but more significantly, I don't know if you've had this experience, but it's very weird. Your voice altered. You start talking like that, and I sounded like a rather ancient Australian, but anyway, it was not a good moment. So I rush off to the emergency dentist, and thank God got fixed up, and the speech went off okay. It went fine. But I've got to tell you, it left me feeling incredibly insecure. So if every now and then you see me doing that, it's because I'm just checking my bridge is still there. it was really not a good moment at all. The other thing I wanted to talk about was being a European. I'm an Irish citizen. I've been an Irish citizen happily for a year. I've actually lived in this country for 34 years. But in 1988, I'd just finished my second stint living and working in Los Angeles. And I came back, and you have to believe me, it was something a surprise. I came back and realized I wasn't coming back to the UK. I was coming back to Europe. I absolutely had come to realize I was not American, that wasn't going to happen. But I came back feeling very much a European. And within 18 months, I think it was within 18 months, certainly within 2 years, together with other colleagues in Europe, we'd managed to found, and I find this quite remarkable, we'd managed to put together European Film Academy, European Film Awards, ACE, that's the Atelier de Cinéma Européen in Paris, and the European Club of Producers. And every one of those organizations still exists. It is quite remarkable. 20 of us started the European Film Academy. I think it's now 3,500 members. And I say this almost really to say, you start something, and if it's right, if the time is right, and if the people are right, it is quite remarkable the way in which you can grow and influence an entire industry. And I take my hat off to you for creating this and for all the people who are supporting you. But that happened to me. That was real. And I'm very, very proud of it. Looking back, incredible. Our first president was Ingmar Bergman. I'm extremely proud of that. I teach now. I teach online. I've been teaching online for 13 years. And I teach in about half a dozen countries around the world. And it's the most satisfying thing I think maybe I've ever done. I learn every single time I confront my students, most of whom are master's degree students. And I feel as I'm in a learning period of my life. What I want to do this evening is try and sell you something which hopefully shouldn't need to be sold, but it's a concept. And that concept is that actually the job that we do as storytellers is a damn sight more important than many of us either realize or certainly colleagues that we talk to realize. Before I used to start a movie, and indeed working with writers, I used to always, in the latter part of my career, I would write a letter. And the letter would say something like, I tried to vary it slightly, but the letter would say something like, tomorrow we're going to start a project. You're in the film industry or in the television business. I've done both. Whenever you go to a party or any kind of event and someone asks you what you do, you say, well, I write television, I write films. All right. The film going to start tomorrow will be one of the 3 you mention when you're asked that question for the rest of your life. Now, I realize that was hyperbole, but it was a wonderful way of getting across to a very disparate group of people that they are in a special profession, that they do always get asked that question, that there isn't time to refer to more than 3 or 4 things that you've worked on. So why not make sure that the one you're doing now is one of those significant films, one of those important films. I produced 30 films, at least 10 of which I prefer that were not on IMDb. So certainly my strike rate is nothing like as good as I'd like it to be. So I'm going to use some slides, I'm going to use some clips, and I'm trying to convince you that what we do is important, what we do is significant, and that the most important component in all of this is our own integrity, the way we see the world, the way we wish to see the world, the way we hope to see the world. We can be co-authors of that world if we set our mind to it, in my view. So I'll start with, if I may, one slide. This one. Now, the only reason that's there is self-evident. You know exactly what happened at the Oscars. But there's 2 important points to make. One is that Everything Everywhere All at Once and The Whale, in particular, the people involved in both those pieces of work, i.e. the people who collected 9 of the Oscars, were people who sincerely believed their careers were over. They really believed that they'd missed the boat, that their time had not worked out for them, and yet here they were, in 2023, walking off with Oscars. I think that was the big, big message I took away from this year's Academy Awards. It's never over until you say it is. Not when someone else says it is, until you say it is. So that's the reason That slide is there. Now, another teacher and good friend of mine teaches in Edinburgh is someone called Mark Cousins. Some of you will have seen some of Mark's really wonderful television and DVDs. In his film, in his series, The Story of Film, he kicks off with this thought.
With all its talk of box office, the film business would have us believe that money drives movies. Ticket sales, marketing, glamour, premieres, red carpets. But it doesn't. Money doesn't drive cinema. The money men don't know the secrets of the human heart or the brilliance of the medium of film. But if money doesn't drive movies, what does? Here's the answer. Ideas. 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 Ideas.
And of course, he is profoundly right. It is ideas that drive everything that we do. Small ideas, big ideas, but in the end, ideas. And if I go to the next slide, I want to make another point. This is a book, wonderful book. If you haven't read it, I'd really recommend it to you. It's the best book I've read on the process of creativity, I think, by Ed Catmull. Ed was one of the founders of Pixar. And he says this, and he's right. The uncreated is a vast, empty space. Now, that may sound like a kind of slightly trite, but it isn't. Most of my students come in thinking that everything that can be made has been made. Every idea that's worth having has been had. Every story worth telling has already been told over and over and over again. We know that's not true. But to remind ourselves, and in my case, to remind my students, that the uncreated is this vast empty space is very, very important to them, so that they don't feel trapped and they don't feel that everything's worthwhile has already been done. So I think what we do is important and significant. I'm influenced a lot by a woman that I read every week called Maria Popova. She's a sort of philosopher, media philosopher, I suppose you could describe her as. She says this. She says, the ability to connect the seemingly unconnected and meld existing knowledge into new insights of how the world works, that's practical creativity. And I use this deliberately as to make the point that the camera, what we do, can shift the world. But she goes on to say this. Then there's moral creativity, to apply the skill we have towards some kind of wisdom on how the world ought to work. And again, our medium has a role in making that possible. Now, when I'm teaching, I only have really one absolute hard cast philosophy, and that's contained in this next slide. I believe absolutely that at its heart, cinema and television indeed, but cinema in particular, is all about identity. What do I mean by that? I mean that movies have this extraordinary ability to see into your soul. Movies have a way of saying, I know that man, I know that man. Or even more powerfully, I am that person. How on earth did they know that about me? That's when cinema really works, when it's able to grab you and allow you the privilege of identifying with the people on the screen. We loan our identities to actors and actresses on the screen. That's what we really do. They're playing our lives out for us. And when the story is right, when the moment is right, we recognize ourselves in that. And I think that is the most extraordinarily powerful thing about the medium we have at our disposal. And then, of course, you've got the issue with the audience. Our audiences want us to succeed. They do not want to walk into a cinema or to switch on their television set and not have us care about their responses and their reactions. Terence Davis, who I admire very much, filmmaker, in his film Distant Voices, Still Lives, I think got this across beautifully. So this 1.5 minute clip, I think, is well worth watching in its own right. They expect us to effectively reach into their souls. That's what they're there for. And our job is to send them out into the night afterwards with something to think about. I've often thought that the most powerful thing about cinema in particular is the conversations that take place in the cafe afterwards. Do they sit down, order a cup of coffee and talk about the weather? Or do they sit down, order a cup of tea and talk about the film they've just seen? That's the test for us. And we know when we succeeded and we know when we failed. Next big question for all of us is, who are we? Do we know who we are? Do we know the way in which we can, in a sense, imagine our own lives invested in the stories we tell? I mean, my own personal belief, and certainly my own experiences, we only have our own experiences to lean on. We have to test everything we do against our own experiences. I had the misfortune early on in my career of working with an extremely nice director, really nice guy. He was that much older than me. And I realized about 2 weeks into the movie that his cultural references were different from mine. So that he actually started asking me, well, why is he doing this? I said, well, he's doing this because of, and I'd worked hard with the writer to create a character that we really believed in. And I realized I'd made a really bad misjudgment, that I'd actually was working with a director who was doing the job. He was a perfectly good director, but his cultural references were not empathetic with the movie we were trying to tell or the characters that we were portraying. That was a really interesting wake-up for me. Now, my own experience, the next clip, is I was 16 years old when this person changed my life, and really did. I went to see East of Eden, the movie. I was full of contradictions, conflictions, issues at home, and I watched this movie, and I watched this man, and all my issues suddenly were there on the screen. I was watching not Dean, I was watching me, or a wish-for version of me, acting out all of my anxieties, all my neuroses. Now, that was a long time ago. I'm an old man now. But every one of you, I would lay a pound to a penny, every one of you will have had your own moment where somebody in some film at some moment was telling you who you were and what your issues were. And this is, again, the magic of what we do. I'm going to move now on to a writer I met a couple of times and certainly admired, and the best book I think has ever been written on screenwriting. It's both amusing and rather wise. Bill Goldman was a washbish, not the easiest person, but he had a lot of truth to tell about the craft that certainly you're involved in, and I tried to play my role in for many, many, many years. I'm going to go to a particular moment, which I think is an important one, certainly for all of us. He discusses the difference between the screenplay you write and the screenplay you sell, and the fact they're not necessarily the same thing, and how you actually deal with that minor or maybe sometimes major paradox. So here's Bill Goldman talking about exactly that.
There is the selling version and the shooting version. When I am hired to do a movie, as I said, I feel I have completed my job successfully if the movie goes, and I have failed if the movie does not go. Now, for a movie to go, a studio executive must say yes. I want to make my selling version of the screenplay as exciting a reading experience as I can make it. And I'll throw in anything I can to make it fun, to make it exciting. I'll throw in asides to the reader. I'll do anything I can do. So the guy is going to say, hey, this could be a good movie. Why don't we do this one? Now, suddenly, when you're a go project, and you're actually going to have your friends hear it, then you think, oh my God, I've got to make this, I can't have this in there. I can't have that in there. Let's try and make this as taut, as skillful as this or as that, let's hope it's wonderful. You always try to make a movie wonderful. I remember talking with George Hill on Butch Cassidy. What we wanted on Butch Cassidy was 20 years from now, that when people talked about Westerns, they would talk about Shane, they would talk about the gunfighter, they would talk about Butch Cassidy. I have this whole theory, movies are not good and bad. That is for the drooling critics to say. Movies either work or don't work when they come out.
And interesting, in the case of Butch Cassidy, it was derided by the critics and initially assumed it was going to be a failure. It's quite interesting that a film that we all regard, I think I certainly do, as an iconic film, didn't look as though it was going to be successful at the time. Now, Bill also talks about, it's very brief, working together, working in this particular case with George Roy Hill. What made me a little unusual, I suppose, as a producer, is that I worked very, very closely with the writer because I wanted to get, I don't know how to put this nicely, I wanted to feel a sense of paternity for the film. I absolutely accepted, as you will as writers, that in the end the mum when you're making a movie is the director. But I wanted to know that I had a paternal relationship with the film, and the way to achieve that for me was to be very, very closely involved in the development of material before it was handed over to mum. And so this is just very briefly, this is Bill Goldman talking about the closeness of his particular relationship, in this case with George Roy Hill. But in my case, it would have been the closest of my relationship with the writers with whom I worked.
I mean, we had a wonderful work experience that summer. It was odd. I went out from New York, where I live, to California, and we met. My memory is we met every day for 2 months, and we went over and over and over and over the script, not altering it much. And he's just going over it and over and over, I think, in his head. And what does this seem like? It's a wonderful experience that you almost never get, talking with someone, going over and over and over the script till the director gets it in his head. Because one of the reasons movies fuck up is because I'm writing apples and you're directing oranges. And no one told us that. It's not out of malice often. It's just because we never said, oh, this scene was meant to be funny. I didn't get that.
Now, this is a very significant point. I used to find, and some of you will have the same experience, you knew the film you were hoping to deliver. And then someone would come along and say, well, you know what, it would be great if we could just maybe do that, or maybe change the casting and it would be this or that. And yeah, all right, that's not a terrible idea. That's not a terrible idea. Maybe we should do that. And then someone else comes up with an idea and says, well, if we're going to do that, what about that? Now, you take none of those concepts or ideas or suggestions materially on their own would alter what you were trying to make. But you absorb 3 or 4 of them, and all of a sudden, you're not going there, you're actually going there. And maybe there isn't where you ever wanted to go in the first place. And he's right, Bill, that you could end up not making the project that you'd intended at all, not because you're a bad person, but actually because you took on board too many suggestions that actually altered the course of the piece of work to a point where you no longer, to forget anybody else, you no longer recognized it. I think that's a kind of important observation. Another interesting thing, because it's relevant, is the whole issue of casting. I don't know if you know this, if you do, I apologize for repeating it, but I got to know Robert Redford well when I was teaching at the Sundance Institute. And only, I think, 10 days before they started shooting, Paul Newman made a decision that he would prefer to play Butch Cassidy than the Sundance Kid. Originally, he was going to be the Sundance Kid and Redford was going to be Butch Cassidy. And it always struck me that an interesting thing, that all of us in January might now be looking forward to going to the Butch Film Festival, had that decision not been made. As it is, thank you very much, I think it's funny too. It's a wonderful thought, it really is. I'm not sure it would sing quite the same way. But the longest clip I want to show it is that it's a 4-minute clip, but I think you'll like it. I certainly enjoy it. But the point, again, that Goldman's making is a very important one, that in order to drive his film, Butch Cassidy, forward, he had to take liberties and he had to insist on certain things happening to make sense of his screenplay and therefore the movie. So this is Bill Goldman talking about why Butch and Sundance were going to Bolivia.
Screenplays are not dialogue. Screenplays are structure. Screenplays are structure. That's all they are. They are structure. They are basic. Certainly dialogue is helpful. Certainly literate dialogue is pleasant. Certainly funny dialogue is fun. But the reality is the reason we can't quote many lines of dialogue, besides, frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn, is because the dialogue doesn't matter that much. Obviously, good dialogue is better than inept dialogue at any time. But for the most part, you have to have the scene that is in its proper place in the structure of the piece. Let me talk about structure using two movies. First, I'll talk about Butch Cassidy, and then I'll talk about All the President's Men. In Butch Cassidy, opening scene of Butch Cassidy, Paul Newman goes and he looks at a bank, and it's very fortified. And he says, what happened to the old bank? It was beautiful. And the cop says people kept robbing it, and Newman says that's a small price to pay for beauty. Okay, so understand, in that, what that scene basically is saying is times are getting hard, okay? Now, he's riding back to his place with the Sundance Kid, and he says, let's go to Bolivia. Now, the audience doesn't know what Bolivia is, and he says Bolivia is where there's lots of money. And he's laughed at, okay? Now, the reality is what makes Butch different and why it was turned down by every studio the first time it was offered was they went to Bolivia, okay? I remember a studio head saying they shouldn't go to Bolivia. And I said, but they did. And he said, I don't give a damn what they did. All I know is John Wayne, don't run away. That's a direct quote. And he said, if you have them stand and fight the super posse, we'll buy it. And I said, but I can't do that. That's not what happened. Anyway, Bolivia is mentioned very early on. Now we got the jump on the cliff. They're about to get killed. The super posse has them trapped. What do they talk about? They talk about Bolivia. Butch says, next time I say, let's go someplace like Bolivia, let's go someplace like Bolivia. And the kid says, next time.
Kid, the next time I say let's go someplace like Bolivia, let's go someplace like Bolivia.
Next time. Ready?
No, we'll jump.
Like hell we will.
No, it'll be okay. If the water's deep enough, we don't get squished to death. They'll never follow us.
How do you know?
Would you make a jump like that you didn't have to?
I have to, and I'm not gonna.
Well, we got to, otherwise we're dead. They're just gonna have to go back down the same way they come. Come on.
Just one clear shot, that's all I want.
Come on. We got to.
Up. Get away from me.
Why?
I want to fight him.
They'll kill us.
Maybe.
You want to die?
Do you?
All right. I'll jump first.
No.
Then you jump first.
No, I said.
What's the matter with you?
I can't swim.
Why, are you crazy? The fall will probably kill you.
Then they jump off the cliff. Etta says, here are all these big bad guys who are after you. Then there's a scene in which says, we're going to Bolivia because you speak the language. Now, the whole purpose of that super posse chase, which was entirely invented by me, the super posse never chased them in real life. In real life, Cassidy heard who it was and he thought, I got to get out of here. But I couldn't do that because I had to justify why he left. I had to have the audience want him to leave. So now Bolivia is mentioned again, so that when we go to Bolivia, we've set it up from the very beginning of the picture. This is the story of two men who go to Bolivia. Western characters don't do that.
And it works. One of the ways I teach online, and this particularly it was something I did during COVID, and it worked very well, is I interview different people, writers, directors, actors, actresses, and bring them into the class, as it were. And it's a real success. One of the people I interviewed quite early on was Lee Hall. I've never worked with Lee. He's someone I admire very much, a particularly nice man. But it struck me that during my interview with him, he said something amazingly wise and very important that very few people, I think, understand about the role that you play and we all play. So I just use this clip of Lee, it's a 1.5 minute clip, telling a very important truth.
That it really is a hard business. If I mean, it's probably worth saying that over the last 20 years, I think that I've written somewhere between 25 and 30 scripts, which I've done 3 or more drafts on, that I've been paid for them all, and they have not been made. You know, this is it's actually a very tough business, and I really think a lot of them are better than the stuff that has been made. but they'll never see the light of day. So if that's going to upset you too much, forget it. For every film that's made, there are 10, 20 scripts, probably a lot more that just don't get made. And so you got to keep knocking. But I think the other thing I've learned is that it's only the good ones that matter. It's only the positive experiences that matter. That you can have a lot of failure, and a lot of the projects that I've done, especially in film, from my point of view, have not worked. Even if they've worked for other people, that's not what I wanted out of them. But that if you can get it right, it'll happen by a fluke. You know, you can't plan this thing because it's chaos.
I mean, that certainly has been my experience. And Lee's advice that he left my students with was this: that good stuff really does take forever to write, and I'll give you an example of that in a few minutes' time. But it is only the good ones that matter, because it's only the good ones, honestly, that people remember, and you don't wait for permission to either succeed or fail. You get on with it. And he's a wonderful example of a man who's, as I say, written 30 scripts, probably had 6 or 7 made, and actually genuinely believes that among those other 23, 24 are the very best work he's ever done. And to carry that thought with you is kind of, well, I find it broadly speaking, encouraging, whilst a real difficult reality to cope with in some ways. I'm going to get a bit personal now and talk about half a dozen writers and relationships that I've experienced. I've worked with about more than a dozen screenwriters over the years. I'm going to start with the person who was my closest friend and by far my oldest friend, Alan Parker, who I really loved and miss more than I can possibly tell you. Here's Alan's career. I say that simply because our very best work does live forever. And I think for me, Alan and the films he produced, films he directed are quite remarkable. And it's an extraordinary group of films. The next slide is the truth. You can't ever replicate the friendships of your youth. All of you, I'm sure, in different ways would have discovered that. As Alan and I, top left, there we are at Cannes, I think in the mid-80s, and as very old men together just before he died. But our relationship started originally in advertising. And fortunately for me, it's on record as to how it all began. And here's Alan talking about that over a period of just 2 minutes of Alan talking about our start together.
One day he phoned me up and he said, I've decided that I don't like all this photographic stuff. He said, you've got to write a script for me. And I said, I can't write a script. I've never written anything longer than 30 seconds. So he said, no, you can do it. So I wrote this script, and miraculously, it got made. I mean, it was most peculiar the way we did it. I mean, it didn't even look like a script, you know. He sent me along another copy of the script and said, look, for God's sake, lay it out like this. He said, otherwise we'll never get the money. And that was the beginnings.
The film was Melody, a low-budget story of young love, directed by Waris Hussein and starring Jack Wilde and Mark Lester. On location, Barry Brown of the BBC interviewed the two tyros, Parker and Puttnam.
What we did to start with, right from the very outset, was to go around to schools and we tape recorded what they thought, what they said and everything, so that we didn't really just end up with how we thought that kids of 11 would react, and whether they could fall in love or whether they couldn't fall in love, or whether...
It was the very first interview for television that we ever did, and Puttnam wouldn't do it on his own, so he made me do it with him, because he was too nervous. And the two of us, I always remember, we sat on this little wall with the Thames in the background, and we were unbelievably bad.
One of the interesting things is that we were amazed how little had changed from the 15 years, 16, 17 years since we were that age.
We were like two dummies out of Burton's window, you know. And in the evening, I got this phone call from Barry Brown saying, Alan, we've seen the film, and Puttnam is dreadful. He is quite terrible. In fact, we're going to have to cut him out. And you were brilliant. You're just natural at this kind of thing. And I'm on the phone thinking, really? Yeah, okay. So he said, so what we're going to do, we're not going to tell David, but we're going to get you back, and we're going to do a whole lot just on you. And I said, oh, fine, great, terrific, that sounds very good. And suddenly, this voice at the other end said, you rat. and it was Puttnam. He said, I think he found out about me very quickly.
So, so our relationship survived that miraculously, but it did. And that whole issue, of casting the right writer to the right subject and not asking them to, as it were, step outside of the comfort zone was certainly something important to me. It also was an economic point of view. I offered Alan £500. He was still talking about for the script. He was still talking about it 30 years later that he decided that I underpaid him. So you can never really win, even with close friends. Another friend was a journalist, Ray Connolly. We'll come on to Ray in a moment. Ray was a rock and roll journalist, essentially. And I had an idea for a film, actually based on a song by Harry Nilsson called 1941. And this is the way that Ray remembers our getting together.
What happened was, I went to borrow this book one afternoon, and we sat down, and he said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "No, not a great deal. I do a bit of journalism." And he said, "Do you want to write a film?" And I said, "Well, I don't know how to, How do you write films?" He said, "Oh, I'll show you." So we sat down that afternoon, and he showed me how to do a film script. Number 1, first scene, number 2, second scene, through to the very end. Then we sat and we planned the whole storyline, him and me together, in his dining room over a cup of tea. And then after that, he sort of said, well, go ahead and write it now. So I was working during the day, and at night I'd work on the film. He'd come for breakfast every morning at sort of 8:30 and read my pages. And over a period of about 3 months, we sort of just wrote the film, I wrote it, but it was him and me working together very, very closely, because he was very enthusiastic, and he pushed me all the time like crazy. And we had a sort of common sight of it. We knew exactly what we were saying,
Isn't that a very unusual way to work with a film producer?
It's perfect. It's the best way, because ever since then I worked on several films and never have I had the same relationship. We literally thought every line out. I would write it all, but every scene was sort of plotted and thought about and talked incessantly. We knew exactly what we were doing. It was wonderful. And to me, I thought, well, all films are like this. It's great. It's a great way to make a living, to write films and get paid for it too. And working all through the night, and then David there in the morning to see it, and laughing at the same jokes and sharing the same experiences. And it was great. I was very naive. I thought all films were going to be like this.
And they're not, are they?
Filmmaking is hell. But that was great.
Anyway, we're very lucky. We did 2 extremely successful films together, which were a kind of bedrock for me in terms of moving on. And they were just rock and roll films. It wasn't an idle thought, incidentally, working like that, because 2 guys who were advertising men in New York, and I came out of advertising, Bob Benton and David Newman, had written a piece about how they'd gone on holiday together and written Bonnie and Clyde. So the idea that 2 guys out of an advertising agency could take a holiday and actually sit down and write a movie, took several years to get Bonnie and Clyde made, was not weird. So I wasn't totally tilting at windmills in attempting to work that way. Next writer up would be Bruce Robinson. Bruce was a former actor, extraordinarily gifted man, who had written a book with Neil and I. That hadn't yet been published, but I thought the dialogue was quite extraordinary, but it was brilliant dialogue. I wasn't interested in making a movie, it was too weird and a bit bizarre for me, but I did persuade him that we could work together on a story I bought, which became The Killing Fields. Now, I mentioned taking a long time. Bruce and I worked for 3 years on the script of The Killing Fields, slowly getting it down. His first draft, I think, was about 350 pages, slowly getting it down to a manageable length. But he's a remarkable, remarkable talent. Someone who has not done his talent enough justice. He's written novels, he's written all sorts of things. But maybe the most naturally gifted dialogue writer I ever worked with. He could conjure up dialogue in the most extraordinary way and make it live on the page. Here's Bruce briefly talking about writing the screenplay of The Killing Fields.
I can't tell you the grief I went through to try and write the thing, not least of which because half the picture's set obviously in Cambodia, dealing in a language, Khmer, which I don't speak, and you can't write in that. So I used to write in the rhythms of it, in the sense of I had a standard Can I do an impersonation of my standard Khmer voice? I used to sort of sit there in front of the typewriter going like this. Oh, yeah, you know, I don't know what the hell it meant, but it was kind of like getting that kind of thing. And I have that in my head, but I'd write it in English, assuming that the actors who were going to speak Khmer would know what I'm talking about. The only thing I made up in the whole film was when they try and produce a passport in the embassy for Pran to get him out. Anyway, so the picture comes out, and I'm talking to Schamberg, or I was talking to someone who was talking to Schamberg, I don't quite remember how it was, and Schamberg insisted that this had actually happened, that they did artificially produce this photograph. Why I bring this up is this is how film and life and the whole damn show spill into each other. It never did in reality happen, but from his perspective, it did happen because it was in the film.
Yeah. So think about that. The person who actually had the experience believed that what we put in the screenplay had happened, despite the fact that we invented it. So I've had this experience on more than one occasion. It is a very remarkable thing. And I think it's got to do with conviction. The story is told with enough conviction, then even the people who participate in it get caught up in it. There's one additional slide on Killing Fields I'd like to show you is this one. This is a page from Bruce's original screenplay. Those of you who have seen the film remember a very dramatic moment when the young child, towards the end, the child gets killed by blown up. And in Bruce's original, this was done with a fine wire attached to a grenade, and the wire was tripped, the grenade took off. The other guy in the photograph, there's a wonderful photojournalist called Neil Davis. And I was having breakfast with Neil when we were actually shooting the film and talking to him about the various things we're doing. And he said, you know what, have you thought about, instead of this grenade idea, have you thought about a pressure mine? I said, well, what's a pressure mine? He said, well, pressure mine is you step on it, and so long as your foot is down on the mine, it won't go off. But the moment the foot's released, it explodes under you. And I said, well, he said, because if you do that, the degree of tension you can create is far, far greater than just a grenade going off. So we thought about this, and of course he was absolutely right. It was a really good idea, and that's exactly the way we shot it, and the sequence works, I think, marvellously well. Much better than had just simply literally a grenade just gone off and blown everyone to pieces. Tragically, Neil was killed 2 years later in a ridiculous kind of coup in Bangkok. But it was his idea that literally turned Bruce's screenplay, perfectly good concept, into something stronger and better. Point being, always be open to other people's ideas if they work and suit your purposes. If they can enhance or improve or develop what you've written, be wide open to it. There's no point in sitting behind, oh no, that's what I wrote, it has to be like that. We gained a lot. That wasn't the only occasion, actually, the Killing Fields, where we didn't learn a lot from talking to people who've been involved in the entire nightmare of Cambodia. Next writer would be Bill Forsyth. Bill, another hugely gifted man. I'd been stupid enough, I knew him from the National Film and Television School when he was a student. I'd been silly enough to turn down Gregory's Girl for whatever reason. I can't really remember why, but I was. But I did capture him and want him to work with me on Local Hero. I'd found a cutting. Several of the films I produced started life as cuttings. The Killing Fields did, Chariots of Fire did, Local Hero did, starting as cuttings in newspapers. And we developed it and worked on it. Bruce again, Bill has a very, very good ear for dialogue. What we wanted to do was a film about the impact on Scots, on a Scottish coastal area of a major oil and gas company setting up and building a refinery. That was the concept. This was 40 years ago. It was before in a sense, the environmental movement as we know it now had really got underway. And interestingly, on its 40th anniversary next week, Local Hero is actually being re-released in the UK, which is a really nice testament to it. But here's Bill's take on the impact of oil on all of our lives. This is a scene walking on the beach from Local Hero.
What'd you make Orcutt then?
He smells the money.
Nice speech this, isn't it?
Yeah. We should come here when we have to discuss business. Hotel's too public.
Right. That's where the jetty will be. And the storage tank's over here, all the way up. Looks just like the model, doesn't it?
Well, more expensive.
It's some business.
It's the only business. Could you imagine a world without oil? No automobiles, no paint.
And polish.
No ink.
And nylon.
No detergents.
And perspex. You wouldn't get any perspex.
No polythene.
Dry cleaning fluid.
Uh-huh. And waterproof coats. They make dry cleaning fluid out of oil?
Oh, yeah, I did not know that.
I didn't know that. You know anything about the stars?
Not much.
Why? I want to check something out. I'll get a book or something. It's business time in Houston. I want to make some calls.
Now, the point I'd like to make there is trying to imagine that dialogue on the page, decontextualized. It's almost meaningless. It only works when juxtaposed with the environment in which it's shot. So the concept was, how do you create deliberately quite banal conversation taking place in an environment which gives the lie to everything they're saying? And I think we were successful in that respect. Another story worth mentioning on this film in particular, when we finished the film and previewed it in Toronto and Seattle, I think, remember, previews are okay. But what was coming back was that the audience were a little bit dissatisfied with the ending. That the ending that we previewed had Mac, going out on a balcony in Houston, looking out on the city and music, and that was the end of the movie. And Warner Brothers, who were very good about things, said, look, we really, really want a big ending. We want Mac to come back, or we want Burt Lancaster to come back. We want something to happen at the end because the audience are grumbling. So, and they offered to pay for the whole thing and everything else. So we thought about it and worked on various possible scenarios, but we knew, and I think absolutely correctly, and when I say the film's being re-released next week, I think this is the reason. This is why the film has lived. We worked out that if we created some artificial happy ending, it would actually destroy everything we'd done. It wasn't going to work. So we were scrounging around the cutting room and we found a shot of the village that actually was a sort of accident. It was the end of a panning shot of the village. And we distorted it to make it look like dawn, the shot, and put that over the very end. And all we added was the sound of the phone box ringing 3 times. Phone rings, box rings, rings, rings. The audience, because they're smart, the audience immediately copped to the idea that this was Mac ringing from Houston back to the village. And therefore, the connection was made. You didn't need him coming back. And then Mark Knopfler's music kicks in and you got yourself a really good ending. And the point I'm really trying to make is, had we gone with the suggestion, which was we want an up ending, the film today would have been one of those films that's been out, been forgotten. As it is, certainly in the UK, I think it's regarded as a classic. And it kind of deserves it because it's true to itself from the very first frame to the very last frame. Did it make as much money as it might have done? Probably not. But it's a far, far finer movie. Last of the writers that I've worked with, or successfully, in a sense, worked with, would be Colin Welland, who's a really lovely man. Lost him a couple of years ago. A very, very good guy. Colin wrote Chariots of Fire, and this is Colin talking about the process of becoming involved in Chariots. The best thing I did in the film was the casting of the key creative components. And fundamentally, that would have been, I think, Hugh as director, certainly Colin's writer.
I won't run on the Sabbath, and that's final.
I did endless research for that film. I went to the National Film Archives and said, what have you got on the 1924 Olympics? Abrahams and Little, who won the gold medals. And I sat there looking at these two young men on silent film and said, don't worry boys, I'll make a good job of it. And that's when I committed myself to them and their sense of right and wrong in the form of athletic prowess. What more could you find? You know, it's absolutely a gift for me. The great thing about Chariots was we didn't ever dream it was going to be the success it was. That wasn't a purpose to make an Oscar-winning film. The purpose of everybody in the film was to make it right and make it true.
So where does the power come from to see the race to its end from within?
And Colin wrote a magnificent screenplay. Interestingly, what he wrote in terms of his voice, Colin was a working class lad from a place called Newton the Willows in Lancashire, and very conscious of class prejudice in the UK, which is common. And really, it offered him the opportunity to give voice to the underclass being angry with what he saw as the elite class. But he was able to do it through the characters of Abrahams and Little. So when you watch that movie, whilst ostensibly it's about a religious Scotsman and a Jewish runner, it's actually Colin's voice being highly critical of the class system in Britain and finding a route through to be able to say what he wanted to say. And just briefly, because all of our careers are a mixture of triumph and disaster, I had a very odd experience of having Bill Forsyth and Colin Welland up against each other at BAFTA for the 1982 awards. This is what happened, but it's not the end of the story.
Thank you, Dennis. The nominations in the category of Best Screenplay are John Gere for Atlantic City, Colin Welland for Chariots of Fire, Harold Pinter for The French Lieutenant's Woman, and Bill Forsyth for Gregory's Girl. And the winner is Bill Forsyth.
Happily, that wasn't the end of the story, because 2 weeks later, he walked off the Oscar. So never get despondent. You never know what's sitting just around the corner. The last story is not triumph, it's more disaster. I worked with a very, very good, very nice screenwriter, Guy Hibbert. And we worked for 3 years together on a project we called The Arctic 30. It was based on a book. Guy had written some very good material, and it was based on a book that I'd purchased called Don't Trust, Don't Fear, Don't Beg, which was about a group of Greenpeace activists who had attempted to stop a Russian oil rig operating in the Arctic. They'd attacked it, they'd been arrested, they'd been imprisoned, and it was their story. It was a very extraordinary story. They were an amazing group of people. Here they are. There's the Arctic 30. And we worked damn hard to make this because it seemed to me at last an opportunity to do something that was about climate change and about the pernicious impact of oil, and at the same time a heroic story. It was heroic because it was built around one of the characters, a Finnish girl on the left there, Sini, who had, in an extraordinary way, had been offered freedom by the Russians because she was from Finland. They wanted to stay friendly at the time with Finland, had refused to leave the prison until all the other 29 colleagues of hers from Greenpeace were released as well. So it was a very uplifting, really terrific story. Unfortunately, when she came back to Finland, she'd had a very difficult time. She became very famous. She's a rather shy girl. And she suddenly turned around after the second draft, I think, and said, you know what, I really don't want to be involved. I'd really like you to write me out of this. Well, you couldn't write her out of it, but you could substitute her. So Guy and I worked on another couple of drafts with a new idea. Well, if she can't be a Finnish girl, why don't she be an American girl? We had an idea of using, as the next slide, basically an officer from Annapolis who knew a lot about the sea, got disenchanted with American politics, joined Greenpeace, and so we substituted her for it. And we wrote a couple more screenplays based on that. However, Cindy's exploits had been rather extraordinary. She's at the top of this thing. She then read this new screenplay about this fictionalized version of herself and said, oh, no, you can't do that. I'd like to be involved again. So we go back to the drawing board and we write a couple more screenplays. Here's the screenplay. We keep on writing, and there's the second draft, third draft, the fourth draft, the fifth draft, the sixth draft, and indeed the seventh draft. At which point, Cindy decides, who I went to meet in Stockholm, that really, she'd been right the first time, here she is, and it was better for her and her home life in Finland that she wasn't involved. She's in the next slide. There she is. And frankly, I gave up. Enough was enough. So 3 years of my life went straight down the drain, trying to make a movie about climate change, which I still hope one day someone, somewhere, might make. It won't be me, and the rights have gone off elsewhere. I'm going to finish with one last slide, if I may. I did a series of interviews with a man called Bill Moyers, actually at Sundance in 1988. And I only want to show this because it echoes, I think, pretty precisely what Ed Murrow said in that very first slide. In the end, we are in a very important business. It does involve a high degree of personal responsibility, and we have to understand the impact of what we do and the importance of what we do, and most particularly the impact of what we do on our audiences. What's important for me here is I parade myself, if you like, in front of young people, master students around the world. And it always terrifies me that the idea that I may be trotting out some piece of nonsense that I hadn't lived by. So I've found it really valuable, the fact that I have the 1988, 35 years ago, interview, where I laid out what my thoughts were. And what's nice for me, and finishing this evening, I wouldn't change one word, not one word, of what I said to Bill Moyers at what would have been the height of my career, really, in 1988. So here's that clip.
But do you think people do things differently because of what they see on that screen?
Not on any one film, and I think this is one of the areas that it's important. I'm glad you asked the question because it's one of the things that's used often to puncture my arguments. No, I don't think any one film's ever going to change anything, and I don't think any one newspaper article's ever going to change anything. But over a period of years, the drip, drip, drip of a lot of good movies, a lot of movies that address real issues, a lot of good articles, the quality of newspapers, the caliber and integrity of newspaper editors, very, very, very important. The effect of that drip, drip, drip daily diet of views and ideas that adhere to what's best in society, that has an effect. Not one movie, not one article, not one building, come back to architects, but just the fact that all of us buckle down and try and do better and be better.
You said a movie tinkers around inside your brain. It steals up to form or confirm social attitudes, that movies actually can help to create a healthy, informed, concerned, and inquisitive society, or a negative, apathetic, and ignorant one.
I believe that, absolutely sincerely.
So that young people who go to the movies are, whether they know it or not, taking something out of there.
Every single movie has within it an element of propaganda, and they walk away with either benign or malign propaganda.
Propaganda, somebody's idea of the way the world ought to be.
Yep. And I think it's an important word, because I think it's a word we shouldn't duck. You and I shouldn't pretend that even in this interview, we're not in one respect propagandizing.
Oh.
It's up to the audience at home to decide whether what we're propagandizing about represents a truth and something worthwhile.
But you made a very large claim for movies. You said, our political and emotional responses rest for their health in the quality and integrity of the present and future generation of television and film creators. That's claiming a lot for this business.
Yes, but I think, in fairness, even if the claim is only half, is only half justified, I think what is important is that people that come into this business acknowledge the possibility of that truth and are prepared to address it, and don't merely come in and regard it as a frivolous adjunct of show business in which the best thing could ever happen to them is 3 pages in People magazine and $1 million in the bank, because the business is about more than that.
So I believe the business is about a lot more than that. We're living in a post-truth society. We're living in a troubled society. We're living on a troubled continent. None of us can project what's likely to happen in the next 2, 3, 4 years. What is certain is that our personal integrity is on the line. And unless we can be sure that we've addressed the nightmare problems that we face, unless we can act as a counterbalance to those who would lie, misinform, disinform us, then we have to ask ourselves what we're doing. We do carry huge responsibility, and that's really the point I wanted to make this evening. I know because of the way in which you gather together, I know because of what Thomas, I think, dreams of this organisation to become, that's important. But you're important, it's important, movies are important, television is important, the future of the planet's important, the future of all of us as a society is important. It may well be partly in our hands. Thank you very much for listening to me.